Welcome to our lecture on abstraction in painting. Of all the different manners of painting, abstraction is, for many people, the most difficult to understand and, for some people, the most difficult to appreciate. What I'd like to do is to clarify some of the ways in which abstraction has been used in the history of painting and to put into context some of the choices that artists have made dealing with abstraction in their work. But before we get started, it'd be useful to clarify some of the terminology. And these are the degrees of abstraction, which basically represent these broad sort of categories that imagery can exist in, ranging from something that is maybe very lifelike, imagine like a Renaissance painting on one extreme, to something that's entirely non-objective, like a Jackson Pollock painting or something of that nature. Keep in mind these degrees of abstraction are not individual discrete categories, but more represent sort of places along that whole continuum of where imagery can exist, from being very lifelike and representational all the way to being purely abstract. So on one extreme is representational imagery. And this is imagery that is intended to recreate the impression of something that exists in the physical world. It's imagery that's meant to look like something else, and do so in a relatively faithful way. It's trying to create a facsimile of something you might see in reality or something that you could imagine to exist in real life. So with this, you might think about classical Greek sculpture. You might think about Renaissance painting, like we mentioned earlier. But keep in mind, there's a difference between realism and representational imagery. These aren't synonymous terms. Classical Greek sculpture is a good example of this difference. You can picture in your head these Greek sculptures that are like the ideal human form. And it's likely that nobody actually looked like that. They were idealized versions of like the perfect human, and that was what was important to them. They weren't particularly realistic looking, although that would come later in Greek sculpture during the late classical and Hellenistic period, when artists embraced like the gritty truth, like a realism. So these aren't mutually exclusive terms. It's just that representational imagery doesn't need to be realism. It could be idealized, or it could be other ways of creating imagery. The main thing is that it looks like something that exists or could exist in the physical world. Abstraction, in the truest sense of the word, is imagery that starts to deviate from being a faithful representation of something, where it still has a foot in the world of things, but the pictorial aspect of it is stylized, or where certain aspects of the object that you're depicting might be simplified or might be exaggerated in order to maybe clarify the meaning more specifically, or maybe to make it a more apply to more things or more situations. And abstraction in that sense still looks like things. Like, imagine like a stick figure would be a good example. It still looks like a person and represents a person. It's just a very simplified way of conveying the notion of person. But if you rearrange the shapes and forms and colors enough, eventually what you have left over doesn't point to any single thing that exists in the physical world. And that's when something kind of crosses over into the world of pure abstraction, or often referred to as non-objective imagery or non-representational imagery. This is imagery that has no reference to the physical world. The artwork becomes its own frame of reference rather than pointing to something else. And this is the essence of what we'll be talking about today, is pure abstraction. And keep in mind, though, one of the really difficult things when you're talking about this with people is abstraction and pure abstraction are terms that technically mean different things, but they're conflated all the time and used pretty much synonymously with each other. And so anytime someone says they're into abstraction, they're probably talking about non-objective imagery or pure abstraction. Um, I think the general impression among people is that abstraction is a newfangled, product of like modern art, and um, and really nothing could be further from the truth. Some of the earliest images that were made that we have record of embrace this concept of abstraction and pure abstraction, as well as being literal references to things. This Paleolithic cave painting from Lascaux is an example of this. You can see, images that are relatively lifelike, like the animal, the contours of the animal, but then you see as these antlers come out, like they kind of deviate from like a pure naturalism or from a pure representational kind of image and start to become, certain things start to become exaggerated about the way they splay out. And here's is an example of like stylizing forms here. But then what's most fascinating to me about this image is that rectangle at the bottom. It's so interesting that, something like a rectangle is something that we would just take for granted in the space that we live in. You see that shape all the time. But imagine a Paleolithic person, that shape would be a completely contrived shape that there would be almost no reference in the real world that they would see of this kind of shape. It's an example of a pure abstract form that, like I said, goes back to like some of the most ancient images that we know about. Embrace this kind of abstraction. And it's interesting to me that there's kind of it feels like there's this set of unwritten rules that dictate the way imagery kind of moves from being purely representational to purely abstract, that you see happening in these Paleolithic artworks that we find. This cave painting here illustrates what I'm talking about. It seems that for things like animals or objects, these artists that drew on these ancient cave walls they gave themselves the permission, I guess, to depict these objects relatively representationally. You can see here with particularly the rhinoceros on the left, that's not totally complete, but also in the like I think a bison on the right hand side, the contours are relatively specific and relatively lifelike in a lot of ways, and practically representationally depicted. But then you see that human form, this kind of glorified stick figure, this man evidently, who is being gored by this bull, and depicted in a way that's not lifelike at all. In fact, much more abstracted than the animals are depicted. And it's so interesting to me that, and this is consistent throughout almost every location that these Paleolithic artworks have been found. You see the similar disjointed thing between the way animals are depicted and the way humans are depicted. And animals are almost always depicted more representationally, more lifelike than humans are, which is a really interesting mystery, especially because they had no connections with these other people that we would know of. They existed these individual tribes. There was no writing. There was no, no overarching like set of rules. But for some reason, these rules seem to be adhered to. And also interestingly, when civilizations did start to arise in the world, like in ancient Mesopotamia first, and then eventually in ancient Egypt, you see some of these same rules that were, kind of unwritten rules that people just seem to follow, for who knows what reason. They became codified rules where they were literally a part of the tradition of that culture. And with ancient Egypt, it's pretty famous the way that they separate their depiction of people from their depiction of animals. And you can see here in the example of Egyptian frontalism, the rules for depicting people were very strict. You had to follow very specific guidelines. It was kind of based on this grid system where every square in the grid was the size of a person's fist. And then the entire body would be, sort of like laid out as a product of fist heights and fist widths. You have the head, which is always in profile, the straight profile, but we know that this has no intention of being representational because the eye is taken out of the socket and plucked right on the side of the head, staring straight out at the viewer, which could never happen in real life. And then the torso, with just magically without a twisting neck, the torso is facing forward again, and then the hips and the legs are in profile again. So it's kind of an amalgamation of different views of the human figure that has no intention of creating a lifelike image at all. Very abstracted, very stylized. However, when you look at the animals in this slide, you can see this vitality and this like kind of lifelike energy that feels very convincing. The animals are handled in a way that it feels like the artist was free to depict them, in this like kind of figurative representational way, whereas that was verboten when it came to depicting the human form. Why is this? I don't know. You could talk about the power of the visual image, and perhaps that was like, in a sense, like kind of playing God when you depicted people, depicted things. That is a real rich history in Western religious tradition, this idea of like kind of creating like a graven image. But for whatever reason, when it came to people, you had to like kind of hold back and not make it too lifelike. But when it came to like animals or plants or other things in the world, you can kind of go to town and do whatever you like. Eventually, the cultures of ancient Greece came on the scene, and they had a huge influence on future civilizations that came along after, including our own. At first glance, if you think about classical Greek art, like the sculptures we discussed, it seems like there was a real turn away from this notion of abstraction. The imagery was very lifelike or very representational, if not always realistic. However, if you look a little deeper, you see that underlying all of the images that come to mind when you think about the classical Greek tradition, underlying all of that is a basis that's rooted in pure abstraction. The notion that aesthetic beauty lies in these proportional relationships between things. And this is as much about mathematics and music as it is visual art. This notion that there exists in the universe sort of this ideal kind of harmonic relationship between things. And when you can find that, aesthetic beauty is the result. This is, in some ways, we kind of take it for granted, but when you really think about it, it's a pretty profound idea. Pythagoras was an ancient Greek philosopher who discovered that when sounds were created, when they existed in frequencies that had proportional relationships to one another, there was this sort of like what we call harmony, this sort of pleasurable sound that emerges through these very specific relationships between tones. And these are really just relationships of frequencies in the sound waves that if they have the right ratio, it creates something that we think of as like a chord when you hit a chord on a piano keyboard. But if you just take your hands and just lay them bronk across a piano keyboard without considering these relationships, it sounds more like noise. And that's the kind of objectivity to the aesthetic experience that the Greeks believed in. And it lies in its roots, it lies in the realm of pure abstraction. When you consider cultures that arose out of the ancient Greeks, like the Romans and their offshoot, the Byzantine culture, which was really Rome, just Rome in the East, you can see abstraction being embraced in a different way than with the classical Greeks. You see a turn away from a desire to replicate physical reality in the name of elevating beyond the purely physical. In the Byzantine culture, art served the purpose of reinforcing religious doctrine, and the consciously abstracted imagery that they used is a reflection of that. But this too goes back to attitudes formed in ancient Greece, with philosophers like Plato in particular. One of the core ideas in Plato's philosophy was a distinction between the physical material world that we exist in and the higher sort of spiritual world of ideas. And this goes on to become a centerpiece of the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious tradition as well. And that's the concept of a physical world that is inherently imperfect and, even debased and morally bad, as compared to the spiritual world that is where perfection can take place, this world of ideas. And this is expressed in the concept of the forms. To put it in a nutshell, imagine a circle. A circle in your head can exist as perfection. You can imagine a circle that's perfect. But if you ever try to draw this circle, no matter how carefully you draw it, once you make it into a physical thing, it has to be imperfect. No matter how precise you are, it's never going to be a perfect circle. The only perfect circle that can exist exists only in your head as an idea. And early Christian artists used this as a basis for deviating from a replication of accurate physical reality. It was a way of transcending the physical world by creating imagery that was abstracted to a point where it almost could never become part of the physical world, or it could never reference the physical world. Take, for instance, the linear perspective in this mosaic. If you look at that fountain, if you look at the side of the fountain, we're looking straight on, and then you look at the top of the fountain, we're looking down at it. It's almost like this cubist amalgamation of different points of view at one time. And it could never exist like that in real life, in the physical world, in the material world. The figures themselves are outlined, and you see this kind of glow around their feet. It's almost like as if they're hovering. None of this depiction is done with the intent of making it look lifelike. In fact, there's a conscious attempt to make it look not lifelike, to sort of transcend the limitations and the imperfections and the debased physical world for a more higher spiritual plane that was so influenced by the ideas of Plato. And in fact, this sort of moral imperative is something that becomes a really significant aspect of Christian theology. The fact that it's not just that this realm of the forms or the spiritual is like different than the physical world, but that it's better than. It's like where perfection lies. It's like the world of heaven versus the world of the earthly. And that's the domain of abstraction. Skipping ahead about 1,000 years, we get to the Renaissance and some of the iterations that play out from the Renaissance. And we see, again, on the surface, kind of like with the classical Greek art, we see on the surface like, highly fictive representational imagery, but underlying it is this profound concern with the abstract level of proportions and relationships within the compositions themselves. They're meticulously planned out with a notion of using geometry to create a sense of clarity and precision and harmony with the compositions. Again, even though these are representational paintings, they operate just as strongly in the realm of abstraction. But it's really after the Renaissance and all of the iterations that played out from it that we find the emergence of what we refer to as modernism. And this is something that doesn't have like a really fixed starting date, but roughly the last part of the 1800s is when these changes take place. And these are a consequence of the Enlightenment and the resulting Industrial Revolution, and really are marked by an incredible growth in the rate of change in society. Before this period, even during the Renaissance, when relatively speaking, there was a really big uptick in development and growth. But before this period, growth happened so slowly and change happened so slowly that it was really hard for a person within a single generation to really see radical changes in their lifestyle and the way that society operated. But in the 1800s, this started happening so quickly that within the span of a lifetime, people could see a radical change in the way that they lived, in the way they interacted with people, in the way they worked and traveled. And this created an awareness of the present moment, awareness of the now, which was a concept that had a different meaning before this time period. The fact that things could change meant that there was almost a morality about impacting change, that things could get better than they are at the moment. And so for the first time, there was a value placed on originality, and that had a huge impact on what was happening in the art world. In this painting, Nocturne in Black and Gold by Whistler is a great example of this. This isn't so much of a picture as it is a moment. It pushes the concept of narrative kind of to the back burner, and this concept of the fictive space that's depicted is more like a void. It's not like a thing that he's painting, it's more of a space. A prominent art critic at the time, John Ruskin, accused him of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. As is usually the case, any kind of newness at the same time as it's being valued in society, it's also almost constantly met with resistance from the status quo, which John Ruskin was a good example of that. A more contemporary critique of Ruskin's critique sums it up. It's not that Ruskin failed to get modernism, it's that he absolutely got it. He saw this was an art in defiance of all expectation, whose enemy was expectation, and that it would be both aggressive to the bourgeois public and associative of aesthetic order. The phrase art for art's sake describes the prevalent attitude amongst literary types of the period that the truest art is work that is complete in itself and doesn't need to be supported by referencing some other thing in the world. Its value is based on its intrinsic qualities rather than extrinsic ones. The only true art is divorced from any didactic, moral, or utilitarian function. And this attitude is summed up by Whistler himself. Said that the imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the man who paints only the tree or flower or other surface he sees before him were an artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. It is for the artist to do something beyond this. And here again we find echoes of the philosopher Plato. Plato was very skeptical of artists and didn't trust them, because the artists of Plato's time were attempting to create a fake version of reality. It might have been an idealized version of reality, but the intent was to make a convincing image. And for Plato, that intent in itself was sort of a taking the ideals of the world, and when you put them into a physical form, it's inherently imperfect. As we talked about with the theory of the forms, the only perfection can exist outside of the physical world, exists on a spiritual dimension, and anything in the physical world is inherently imperfect. And in that sense, I kind of think, even though Plato was famously distrusted artist, I kind of think Plato would have appreciated pure abstraction as an art form, in that it isn't attempting to create a debased kind of fake version of something that exists in the world, but it was creating its own reality. With all the rapidly changing conditions and events as industrialization really hit full stride, people were had more awareness of, of, of the present moment, of now. And this awareness that we certainly take for granted, that time is like an arrow that moves forward. And in order to move forward, you'd have to break the rules that restrain the artist and define art. The true artists are those on the cutting edge. And these very rules seem to break down little by little through the latter part of the 1800s, from the flattening of space, of realism, through the exploration of the fleeting impression of light and impressionism, to the psychological intensity and heightened color of the post-impressionists. And finally, we get to the 20th century, where artists like Matisse and his group, the Fauves, broke all the rules of color that were kind of, the envelope had been pushed by the post-impressionists. But still, they were grounded in the Western values and conventions of composition and space. But that was about to change with Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, made Matisse look tame by comparison. Picasso here breaks all semblance of the cohesive picture plane or spatial continuity in the painting. That finally, was finally kind of crashed through the ceiling of the Renaissance, and suddenly now seemingly all the rules were broken. So where do you go when all the rules are broken? Are there any rules left to break? And that's where Kandinsky steps in. And he, if there was, does the painting even need to be the picture of anything anymore? And to Kandinsky, the answer was no, it did not. Kandinsky was the first kind of widely known artist from the Western tradition that, in the Western modern tradition that worked non-objectively, where the imagery had nothing necessarily to do with the physical world. And there's a really interesting story, or maybe legend is a better way of putting it, of Kandinsky's discovery of pure abstraction. Returning to his studio one evening after having taken a break from painting, he saw in the dimly lit space a painting of indescribable beauty imbued with an inner flame, seeing only forms and colors whose meaning was incomprehensible, and was utterly perplexed at what he was looking at. One of those moments where you're completely caught off guard and have no idea what you're seeing. But the mystery was solved when he recognized, oh, wait a second, I just had my painting on its side. Oh, no problem. And he stood it upright that's better. Now I can see what it is. But then he realized there was something magical in that experience of looking at his painting with that sense of utter incomprehension. And it was this kind of sustained sense of discovery and looking and searching without being able to attach a label and pigeonhole that experience. And that's when he realized that the subject in a painting only gets in the way of that truest and purest art experience. Kandinsky was attempting to translate the most profound human emotions into universally comprehensible symbols and visual sensations using color, shape, line, pure forms. And often his works had titles that were the same as a musical composition might have been. And that was in a sense on purpose, because he related very much to the way we experience music in the way he wanted us to experience his paintings. And you can imagine a piece of music that you can listen to, whether it has lyrics or not, whether you even understand the lyrics. You can imagine being very moved by that piece of music. As humans, we've been conditioned in our society to appreciate sound very deeply as an aesthetic um, um, response that we have to it. Where, like, ever since you're a little baby in a crib and your mother's singing to you, we can get aesthetic pleasure from sound really easily, and music can have that capacity to move us. But Kandinsky thought, and I agree with him, that the same exact sensations can come through your eyes as that come through your ears. It's just we haven't been conditioned to experience it quite that way. I think we're conditioned to experience vision as a pragmatic tool to make our way through the world, to get information about the world that we can use. But that kind of undermines the capacity to appreciate pure vision in the way that we can appreciate pure sound. But to Kandinsky, these things were inextricably linked. As a metaphor, you could imagine like lyrics in music are akin to imagery in paintings. And I'm sure you've all had this experience like I have where you heard a song several times and you thought, wow, this is super cool. But then you listen more carefully and you hear what the lyrics are and you think, oh, this is actually really dumb. And in hearing the lyrics can kind of ruin the experience of the song for you. And that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the non-objective imagery kind of getting out of the way and allowing us to like see in that purest sense of the word. And Kandinsky that held a lot of power, and that was like the purest iteration of a visual experience. As you can see, not all of Kandinsky's pieces were purely non-representational here. Where these pieces after this big discovery he had. Here we see works that are, like very abstracted, but still kind of have references a little bit to visual things. Like you can see cannons kind of in the lower right hand side, maybe fortresses or mountaintops or clouds, but essentially the imagery is kept at bay, and you almost only kind of discover it after you look at it for a while. Interestingly, Kandinsky gets all the credit, or I guess if you don't like it, blame for this breakthrough of non-objective painting in Western art history. There were others who were kind of exploring this well before him. Hilma af Klint is one example. Of course, with her, part of the reason is because she demanded that these big large paintings were kept hidden from view until 30 years after she died. And so it's no wonder that she never really got traction in the annals of art history until kind of recently, where now she's like incredibly popular. There were others too that predated Kandinsky. And then of course, if you look at a broader sense, culturally speaking, there are whole entire cultures whose work is predominantly non-objective all throughout the history of art. And so it's a little kind of, short-sighted and ethnocentric to see Kandinsky as really the first non-objective painter. But he was the first like really prominent one who really changed the whole course of art history because of his influence. And once Kandinsky came along, the floodgates of pure abstraction were blown wide open. Kazimir Malevich is one example of an artist who using the language of Kandinsky, attempted to reject deliberate illusions of painting, creating a new painterly realism. The subject was the basic components of painting's language. That's one example. Another example by Malevich is famous white-on-white compositions, trying desperately to free art from the dead weight of the real world. I took refuge in the form of the square. And just as all this was coming to head in the world of art of Western culture, we enter World War I, which was impossible to overstate the catastrophic effects of the Great War. Um, and it spawned a wide range of responses from artists working, and this trend towards abstraction never really goes away, but it does change form, and a lot of that kind of comes out of several important uh, cultural influences. Existentialism is one of them. It was a philosophical response to, the absurdity of the universe, and a kind of central tenet is that we are free, and that's not necessarily a happy thing. We're condemned to be free, and we don't have any choice in the matter. We're responsible for our behaviors, and the best thing you can do is to be your true, authentic self. This had a big impact on what artists did. Another influence was Sigmund Freud, and particularly his personality theory, that basically described you as a person. Your fullness of yourself is not just your conscious mind, which is like the tip of the iceberg sticking up above the surface, like your memories, your internal dialogue, but most of who you are, like 99% of who you are, was beneath the surface of the water, and by that I mean outside of your conscious awareness. And this was we kind of take it for granted now in a lot of ways, but at the time this was very revolutionary idea. So if you're, the highest goal you can have is to be your true self, um, then who the hell is that? That's kind of like, to be yourself and live your authentic self. It kind of comes out of existentialism, and then how do you discover who that self is? That kind of comes out of Sigmund Freud, and the two of those together are a huge influence on this broad movement of art that we call surrealism, that dovetails with a lot of abstract tendencies. So one way that was suggested that you could bypass the limitations of your conscious awareness and gain access to your true or unconscious self was through your interpretation of chance events. So, surrealism was, of course, a literary movement as well as an art movement, and surrealist poets would have a whole lot of words all collected in a hat, and they would draw words out one by one at random and string sentences together to create whole poems. And it's pure randomness, pure chance, but then in the way that we interpret that chance and the meanings that we find in it reveal a lot about our deeper selves. Visual artists were using these same laws of chance in some of their compositions. In this one, theoretically, the paper is torn up and then dropped from above and allowed to land on this surface, and then that becomes the composition, completely bypassing the artist's hand and the limitations of the artist's intent. Not necessarily quite as non-objective in the purest sense. There was another way to bypass your conscious self, was to purposely avoid any kind of planning at all, and try to live in the exact spontaneous moment that you're at the time, by developing the composition of a painting as it goes, not doing an underpainting, not doing any kind of planning, but relying on your intuition to complete the image. Kind of these biomorphic, kind of dreamlike images by Miro are another kind of form of surrealist painting, and to Freud, some of the deeper aspects of yourself can be understood through the language of dreams. So surrealism was a movement that predominantly occupied a lot of the space between the two world wars, which, if you really think about it, my opinion is that historians way later down the road are not going to really see these as two separate world wars, but more like one long war with a break in between. The World War II was an even bigger catastrophe in terms of loss of life and disruption of civilization, um, especially when it came to like the political movement of fascism. Um, the the um, the the fascist point of view is very antagonistic toward any kind of these kind of modern art movements that questioned tradition, that questioned authority, that questioned the foundations of Western civilization. These were all the antithesis to the Nazi ideology that was kind of sweeping through Europe during World War II, looking like perhaps it would prevail and liberal democracy would be over, and that created an exodus of artists and intellectuals and thinkers from Europe. And there was only really one place in the quote civilized world that was virtually untouched by World War II, where the infrastructure was not only still intact, but in fact the economy was booming from the war, and that was the United States. And so we have all these people moving to the United States from Europe, for one, to avoid the Nazis that were kind of natural enemies to the artist, to the modern artist at least, and then two, in the ashes of the war, the economy in Europe was in shambles, and so the United States became the cultural center of the Western world, which is a really big deal. And of course, the place where any immigrant is likely to go when they move to the United States is New York City. So that becomes like the new Paris in a way. That became the place where there was like the nexus of art and culture. And it also becomes the home to the next kind of broad movement of art and especially it has to do with abstraction, and that is abstract expressionism, or the New York School. Where the Surrealists were very much influenced by Freud, the abstract expressionists were more influenced by one of Freud's contemporaries, or maybe proteges, and that's Carl Jung, who extended Freud's concept of the unconscious self and expanded that to involve like all of humanity in a sense, like like roots that go deeper than the individual and tie all of us together as a species. And this influence caused artists to seek, universal themes in their work, a little bit like what Kandinsky had talked about earlier, with searching out these like kind of visual images that could be understood by anyone, because they didn't convey a specific thing from the physical world. Also, a big influence on abstract expressionists was Clement Greenberg, one of many critics who wrote about these artists, and one of the things that Greenberg saw happening in abstract expressionism in the middle 20th century world of these New York artists was medium specificity. That painting was becoming more clarified as being its own thing rather than being something it isn't, almost as a moral imperative. So for instance, in a Renaissance painting, the painting looks like a window, and you could almost imagine standing in front of it, and even almost like a believable way that it kind of opens up and creates a space behind it. But to the abstract expressionists, that was a lie. Why would a painting try to be something it isn't? If a painting is a painting, it should be a painting, and it shouldn't try to be a window. A painting is flat, and that's that flatness of space is one of the things that makes it what it is. So why lie? Why not be its truest, authentic self? Arshil Gorky is one of these artists that moved from Europe and came to America in the ashes of the war, and he became a very influential figure to the abstract expressionists that came up around him and after him. We see these like kind of these broad biomorphic forms, not all that dissimilar to some of the things Kandinsky was doing. Like all these abstract expressionists, it's hard not to link them right back to Kandinsky in a lot of ways. But here you see like much more like kind of gestural color and mark making. And next we have the first person who was born in America on this whole broad list here, Jackson Pollock. Um, you know, um, was born in Wyoming, but began his career in earnest in New York, and was influenced by all these artists that were coming onto the scene, and really the mature works that were most known. He started off as a surrealist, much more in that vein. But as he developed his style more and more, he got more and more into like pure abstraction, and more into the gesture of the mark, and denying any kind of pictorial representation of something. He was one of the branches of abstract expressionism that was sometimes dubbed action painting, where the mark making was about like a very lots of movement, and very maybe crude rather than refined, and painting on canvases generally very large that had no focal point, had no kind of compositional hierarchy, and no beginning or end. It was like a wall of sound hitting you all at once. To the abstract expressionists, in particular, ones that were like Jackson Pollock, the whole notion of working in this way was a way to tap into a primordial human consciousness through this pure visual imagery. And it's almost like you're in this transcendent state while you're working. And I think we could all probably connect to that when you're really focused on your painting. Like it feels like time just disappears. And so you could use this as a way to attain a higher state of consciousness even. Associated with the color field branch of abstract expressionism is Mark Rothko, whose shimmering, soft rectangles of glazed color are absolutely captivating to look at. And here's where I'd like to draw a distinction between this notion of non-objective painting being or non-objective artwork being artwork that doesn't have content. And you'll even see this in some textbooks, and it's like a complete misrepresentation of what's going on here, because of course it has content. Just because it's not depicting an image of like a dog or a person or a chair doesn't mean it doesn't have content. And that was something that Mark Rothko was very adamant about. There's no such thing as a good painting about nothing. It's tragic. It's heroic. It's just like, again, I keep going back to Kandinsky, but just like the way Kandinsky linked his work to like these symphonic movements, that same kind of profound experience you can get through sound. It's there for you to look at if you look closely enough and carefully enough. Not like a riddle to solve or anything like that, but more just the capacity to allow yourself to take it in. Some of Rothko's most special work are like really easy for you and I to see. Just a few hours away in Houston, next to Rice University, is the Rothko Chapel. And this is a location where it was kind of built around this concept of like 8 walls that have these you could almost say giant paintings, on each wall. And you walk into the space, and in this way, it's like really emblematic of that, like the delicate magic of Rothko's work. You walk into the space, and all you see are these giant black rectangles, and it just looks like so minimal, almost like some people even like think it's a joke or something. You see like rednecks walking in, God damn, this is an art. I don't know what the hell this is, and storming out. But if you sit long enough, where your eyes start to grow accustomed to the dim light in the space, you start to notice after a while, ever so slightly, the shimmering kind of burgundy of the surface. And it's almost so subtle as to be barely perceptible. And then as soon as you notice it, and then that kind of, it becomes this self-reinforcing kind of feedback thing, and then you notice it even more, and then you notice it even more, and then pretty soon these paintings just like come to life off the wall. And if I'm explaining it in this kind of excited tone, that might be misleading, because it's not something that's going to bowl you over. It's not that kind of exciting. It's super quiet, super subtle. It slows down your heart rate and you just breathe. It's a very meditative kind of experience, and incredibly beautiful if you allow yourself to really see it. The first generation of abstract expressionists were pretty, I don't know, like serious, melodramatic. They were trying to carry the weight of the whole universe on their shoulders, and that took a toll. And for instance, the two we just looked at, Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock, both met untimely early deaths, and you get the sense that they just like took it all very, very seriously, like suffered for their art in the truest sense. But what happened around them and in their wake was something that typified the work that was being made, which involved a radical individualism, and the content. We just spoke about content. The content is inherent in the process of the painting, the materiality of the painting, the scale of the painting, and we're going to look at some examples of different ways of moving through these different considerations of abstraction. Frank Stella, among a lot of other things, worked with these flat, solid images and sometimes played with shape of the support, and concentric lines, subtle color manipulation. And unlike Frank Stella's kind of harder edge geometry in the painting, artists like Agnes Martin embracing a similar kind of geometry, but in this kind of softer, more diffused and gradual kind of way. On the West Coast, artists like Richard Diebenkorn were exploring compositional space and openness, and considering these contradicting senses of depth in the picture plane. Bryce Martin, this lyrical, continuous line, flowing, gradual, soft color transitions. And when I mention process, consider artists like Helen Frankenthaler, who began working in this manner with the development of acrylic paints, which allowed for a much easier manipulation of the viscosity of the paint. And she would she would mix the paint in jugs to runny, almost like milk, and pour it out onto these canvases and lift these canvases in different locations and allow gravity to move these swaths of paint around. Very specific in terms of process. Gerhard Richter, who has a very long career, still living, in fact, and has worked in many, many different styles, but some of which is this pure abstraction derived from layers of paint on this surface that he'll pull across one another with a giant squeegee. I'm working on a massive scale and creating these color transitions and figure-ground relationships that are almost just outside a sense of control, kind of like the way Jackson Pollock would fling the paint from above. Or Thomas Noskowski, investigating depth again, where, working in the language of pure abstraction, but embracing a sense of space. We see kind of stenciling and overlapping of forms and almost a sense of atmosphere. With Jacqueline Humphreys in a painting like this, you can see that process unfolding almost like a narrative before your eyes. You can see the layers and what happened on top of the first and what happened on top of that. There's a sense of masked out areas and also transparency with opacity to create this complicated, subtly transparent sense of surface. Artists like Byron Kim, who in this particular project envisioned it's sort of like a group portrait of all these different people by painting just their skin tone on a flat rectangle and hanging them all together in a grid. Sometimes people make the mistake of seeing non-objective painting as being, purely either expressive and quick or like minimal and broad, like the color field painters. But non-objective painting can also be like highly detailed and meticulous, and emphasizing the tiniest bits of information and tiny little scale mark making, like illuminated manuscripts almost, like an artist like James Sienna here. Stephen Westfall exploring the juxtapositions of direction, line, shape, and these alternating color bands. Very decorative. Or Annika Faroke, who experiments with taking a really large, I guess like a comb almost, and pulling pigment across the surface in this kind of minimal action way that leaves behind a really complex and rich sense of texture and elegance. So I'm hoping that in all those examples of works that we looked at, you might have some ideas about how you might approach this, what kind of strategies you'd use to create a non-objective painting. The sky's the limit. The only stipulation is that it does not include any imagery that points to objects in the physical world. That's the challenge. It's really easy to make an abstract painting compared to making a representational painting. It's really a lot harder to make a good abstract painting compared to a representational painting. You can't rely on what the images communicate in order to be a crutch for having someone like it. If you paint a picture of a kitty cat, anyone's going to probably likes kitty cats is probably going to like it, no matter how shitty of a painting it is. So that's what you're up against. You can't rely on the imagery to make the painting moving. This is also the time of the semester when I like to share some of my own work, because my work tends to often occupy this realm of imagery, non-objective. Even if you could see kind of subtle nods to things in the physical world, like a topographic landscape or maybe clouds, it's essentially non-objective. And so the next couple slides are going to show some of my work, and then after that there are also a lot of examples of student work that previous responses to this charge I'm giving you. I want you to look at those examples and try to think about the ways that they were made in concrete terms. What did the person do to make that happen? This is going to be all about you coming up with a strategy for creating a painting, and feel free to step as far outside of the standard, mixing the paint with the knife and putting it on with a brush. You can do anything you want here. Nothing is off limits as long as it doesn't look like something in the physical world. This painting is from maybe like 8 years ago or so, and a lot of my work for quite a while has involved like really thick impasto textured surfaces, and basically sort of where the paint is built up with a knife, and the surface of the paint itself becomes a landscape, or becomes landscape rather than being a picture of a landscape. Also, I generally worked and still to some extent like in a larger kind of scale like this one. In this smaller painting, you can kind of get a better sense of what the surfaces are like, um, where they're kind of mounted up in piles with really subtle color differentiations from one area to the other, paired with like more contrasting areas. At about this same time, had two kind of big monumental things in my life happen. My mother died, and my first son was born, and it got me thinking about cycles and birth and death and like night and day. And my work has always kind of been about these like kind of oppositions or kind of didactic opposites. And I did this series of paintings that were on plexiglass where I mounted lights behind them. And so when the gallery space is dark, the light shows through the painting, and all these colors from these glazed layers on top of one another kind of shine through. And this is one such painting as it looks in the dark. But here you can see on the left what this painting looks like when the gallery is lit, like a gallery normally is. And the surface of the paint becomes opaque. I used a lot of zinc white with wax medium to build up these thick layers of paint that reflected the light when it hit it. But then when the lights were turned off, it essentially disappears and allows the light from behind the canvas to show through. And this, in as much as this is like kind of, a metaphor to landscape on the left-hand side, it's like this vast kind of snowy field that's kind of a depiction of the area where my mom grew up in Canada. And then on the other side, when the lights are off, the opacity disappears and it becomes more like a sky. So again, like kind of night and day, earth and sky, birth, death, all these like kind of metaphors are part of the work. As I was doing the glaze layers that are underneath the thick white paint in those backlit paintings, I remembered all the glazing that I did when I was in undergrad, and remembered how much fun it was to see the color evolve layer after layer. And so then I began a whole series of paintings that involved none of the thick impasto paint that most of my work had involved for like almost 20 years, and started embracing like an incredibly thin, smooth surface that like almost became reflective, almost like metal, where I would involve hundreds of glazed layers of acrylic paint that slowly build up, and each layer kind of reflecting the light in a slightly different kind of way. And I also started kind of playing with this idea of the picture plane, and started creating these paintings built up out of what essentially could be a rectangle turned in space. So each one of these panels that makes up this piece here is a quadrilateral that if you took a rectangle and turned it a certain orientation in space, it would look like this. And then kind of playing with that opposition between the flatness and the depth. Hard to see these because in real life they reflect color differently depending on the angle you see them through the use of these refractive pigments that are suspended in the medium. After kind of playing with those shapes, I decided to do a backlit painting with the same kind of structure of these quadrilateral forms, and this is a detail of a piece that happening. So when these backlit pieces are exhibited in a gallery setting, I kind of I set up the lights in the gallery space to cycle very slowly from fully lit, full bright gallery lighting, and then slowly dimming into half light, and then all the way to where the lights are completely off, and then cycling back through again to the light. And depending on the show, I've done like I think 4 shows that are like this. I kind of want to make that transition happen slow enough to where you don't really notice it happening. It's almost like if you're a little kid and you're outside playing, and then suddenly you realize it's dark, but you never noticed it getting dark. So that slow, gradual transition of time, revealing the different aspects of what the painting is, with in this kind of meditative kind of way. And I would always have a soundtrack that would go along with this exhibition that kind of reinforces the sense of cycles and this sense of like this kind of durational kind of experience of the work. But this slide here just kind of shows what this one detail shot, this one particular passage of that painting looks like in these 3 different stages that it slowly cycles through in a gradual way. While at a residency in Iceland a couple summers ago, I started working on this photo paper that they had there and doing these acrylic paintings on photo paper with these crisp kind of edges and with lots of glaze layers kind of built up on one another. And that was another way of kind of manipulating the sense of the flat picture plane with this illusion of depth that was really interesting to me. I'm sort of trying to set up a certain kind of frame of reference through color and shape and positioning, and then trying to undermine that by creating contradictory experiences and clues that that I hope to kind of make it kind of perplexing and kind of confusing in that way. So next I want to show you a couple paintings by a good friend of mine who also happens to teach at Texas State. He was originally a student at Texas State, which is when I first met him, and when I first started teaching there, and has come back since. And his name is Michael Villarreal, and I want to look at his work because when he was an undergrad, he kind of went through this kind of transition from working kind of figuratively into working in a more abstraction sort of vein. And this painting here was from kind of midway through his undergraduate career, maybe toward the end, but when he was doing these paintings of people's faces, obviously, and what he was doing is setting up these photo shoots where he would set someone on a table and then light them with different color lights, and then kind of reassemble them into like almost like a collage kind of painting. But what he realized as he was working, that like what he was really trying to get at was this mass, the sense of mass of these objects, and the fact that they were faces was almost a distraction to what was the essence of what the painting was really about. And so he kind of went about kind of throwing out every element that wasn't actively carrying the painting in the direction he wanted to take it. Anything that was distracting, anything that wasn't that got in the way of that didn't belong. And so his thesis work looked very different. Well, kind of different. I'll show you. This is one of his paintings from his thesis show, and you can see that sense of mass, these biomorphic forms kind of pushing together is there still, but everything else is gone. All the extraneous things are kind of thrown out to get at a more pure iteration of what he was trying to achieve in the work. And here you can see this like kind of this mounds of paint, beautiful textured surface, very aggressive. Yeah, so that's kind of this evolution from like more representational imagery to a more abstracted imagery. So next, we're going to look at some student examples of this project. Looking at these examples, think about the different processes involved and what can happen, and just to kind of give yourself ideas, different approaches you could take. But more than anything, think about the limitations that each person imposed on the work. The worst thing you can do here is to try to do too many things in a single painting. Come up with a couple issues, like 1 or 2 issues that the painting is really about, and everything else, don't throw it in there. If it doesn't belong, don't include it. And try to, just like we looked at in Michael's examples, try to get rid of any extraneous issues that don't actively carry the painting to where it's going. So what usually the people who go wrong in this project, their painting looks like everything but the kitchen sink kind of thrown on there. And then that kind of takes away from the power of any individual decision when there's too many competing things going on. Really pare down the amount of different things you're trying to do. Just try to do one or 2 things really well with this, rather than like a whole bunch of things that you try to foist into one painting. Keep in mind, you can always make another abstract painting. You don't have to like put all of your ideas into this one thing. Really try to clean it, make it clean, make it a pure iteration of what you're trying to do. And that's something that I think you'll notice when you look at all these examples. The more successful ones aren't trying to do too many different things. Settle on a kind of mark or a use of color or a use of space or a use of shape, but don't throw everything all mishmashed together. This person ground up charcoal and mixed it in with an acrylic medium and then kind of spread it across the surface and then kind of picked it up with rags and pushed and pulled. And there's also this really subtle text written across it that is so subtle that you can't even really see it hardly at all. It's almost like a mystery or like an ancient civilization that's like barely uncovered. This person essentially created like maybe the equivalent of like the snow on a television screen, like in the movie Poltergeist, taking all these different paints that she had on her palette, mixed them into one color, and then globbed it on the canvas. Then mixed another color, globbed it in the canvas. There's a sense of randomness about it that distributes the visual information across the entire surface. This person did these marks on a hunk of burlap mounted to this blue kind of insulation foam, kind of this interesting square within a square. And then look at the complexity of the different colors on the inside, all the different kinds of white. This was done on fabric, and it involved like kind of the paint kind of staining into the fabric as well as being applied in a more traditional kind of brush way. And then the fabric itself became part of the identity of the piece. Instead of stretching it around a frame, it's like hung with all of its wrinkles and all the kind of the imperfections of this hunk of fabric. Here the student poured a layer of acrylic paint on the palette in these different kind of swirling colors, and then once it dried, peeled it off and then applied it like a collage onto the canvas. And all these unpredictable breaks in color and shape happened from that. Here you see the use of masking tape and then applying a layer of color, then take off the tape, then let it dry, then apply another layer of color, take off the tape, let it dry. And this is one thing that you can kind of build up a real kind of interesting complexity of color interaction by doing this. Keep in mind, doing something like this, it might be good to use acrylic rather than oil paint because it'll dry quicker and allow you to do more layers in a shorter amount of time. Another project involving masking out particular areas of the paint. This student was kind of playing on the idea of like an RGB, color system, like on a computer monitor or a TV, and placed these systematic marks parallel to one another, filling up the entire composition. If you zoom out on this a little bit, you can see that there are these 6 kind of almost like wedge-shaped kind of objects kind of floating around in this sea of these parallel marks. This person used a giant sheet of plywood and spent maybe like a half hour coating it with this blue and black, this subtle transition between a blue and a black, and then probably spent like 10 hours maybe applying this masking tape across the whole surface and meticulously cutting out this pattern, repeating over and over again throughout the entire composition, and then removing those areas and then coating it with white paint and then taking off the tape. And it reveals this really interesting juxtaposition between light and dark, between like gradual and undulating versus like solid and flat. Turned out really nice. Here's a repetition of this like kind of almost scale shape. The same color scheme, just a whole lot of varieties of these different kinds of greens or areas, these analogous like kind of range of colors close to the green, filling up the entire composition, almost in this obsessive compulsive kind of way that's really, the color is really rich and interesting. this was part of a triptych, and so there was another image here that I didn't include because it was a little easier to see just two of them on the screen. But all three of the paintings began as a Necker cube, and this student restrained herself to using only marks that went parallel, that built upon the lines that were already present in this Necker cube, and reducing every single mark only to this like tinted out blue and this kind of toned down orange. And so it's like this restriction that allows the identity to come through. So really think about how you can restrict your decision making in order to to do very few things really well rather than trying to do too many different things. It doesn't have to look as minimal as this. It could look back like really detailed, like the last piece we just looked at. The difference is not trying to do too many different things within one single painting. This person was very adamant that when she looked at people, she could see auras around them, and so she did a whole series of paintings on these circular canvases that were portraits of these people that she knew, and the colors of each of them were derived from the auras that she would see. And this created a really good framework for whether she actually saw them or not. It created a really good framework for making decisions about how to make the painting. And you see these concentric kind of shapes that kind of feel like these vibrating kind of aura patterns on this circular background that kind of fits the concept as well. And I thought this is just one of maybe 5 or 6 that she did that were really striking. Speaking of shape, the shape and the materiality of the support you choose can play a really big role in what comes across from the piece. These octagonal shapes, it's hard to see an octagon and not interpret stop sign out of it, right? And although it's not a stop sign, but it kind of that shape alone kind of carries that weight. And here you can see like these are relatively large and kind of minimal, but really interesting the way they play upon this kind of angle and wedge shape and use this alternative support in the plywood and then alternative kind of shape in the octagon. This person cut out pieces of wood based on the wood grain patterns. So she created these really compelling shapes just in and of themselves, and then used that same wood grain pattern as something to predicate these concentric kind of color shapes off of. And again, this person did a whole bunch of these, and collectively they looked especially interesting, and each one had its own unique character that was really cool. And again, like coming up with a strategy or your own kind of logic as to how you make your decisions is a really important part of this project. This person used a really pared down color scheme in order to give herself room to do a whole bunch of things with shape and texture and solidity and mass, all these differentnesses within these 3 giant panels looked almost like coffins on the wall. It's like choosing one visual element to tame, in this case color, to allow all these other visual elements like shape and texture and space to go nuts, to go crazy, and still have it read as a cohesive whole. Again, it's almost more about what you don't do than it is about what you do. One of the limitations this person had was to restrict herself to just a limited number of touches on each painting. And this was a part of I think there were like 40 of them in these 2x2 mini canvases, and each canvas had a set of colors she could use, and it could only do like, I think it was like maybe 3, maybe looking at that bottom right one, maybe more, but like say only 4 times could she touch it, and then that had to be the painting, and she had to move on. And so that puts so much pressure on each individual decision that kind of creates almost this like kind of existential confrontation every time she touched the painting. But then collectively they created this really compelling wall of color. While not non-objective in the strictest sense of the word, is like that looks like kind of a basketball hoop and maybe like a like a seawall or something down below it. But I wanted to show this image because of this person's capacity to live in the moment and to think spontaneously. One of my favorite students I ever had. But he would drive me insane. He'd be working in the corner. I'd come over and see his work, and we'd talk. And it's like, "What do you think about this area?" It's like, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe that's a little dark. Maybe you should lighten this a bit." You know, kind of little kind of tweaks because the painting was looking super cool. I'd come back around 40 minutes later, and the painting is gone. He'd wiped out entire sections and completely like it was like a revolution, like totally different painting. It was like, "What are you doing? That looked great." And he's like, "Yeah, well, I fixed this one area, and then that area didn't work anymore, so I just had to fix it." And he just had no compunction of just wiping away like hours and hours and hours worth of work because that's what the painting called for. And I love that kind of courage. I love that kind of capacity to not to not like kind of phone it in, and to let the painting be its authentic self and be the best painting it can be, regardless of what you already did. What's the best thing that could happen? Anyway, that's why I want to show this painting. It's also a really cool painting. Here's a detail shot of another student who worked with these like real honest singular marks and then voiced them all together into the canvas. And but that mark, you said, lots of different colors, lots of different shapes, but all of them have that same, what's unified about it is all of them have that same kind of thick unidirectional brush stroke that ties it all together. So anyway, that's the entire lecture on the abstraction, pure abstraction project. Thank you for watching.